Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Christian Miller about studies in psychology that seem to show that our actions are more influenced by the situations that we're in than by our character or conscious willing. We also talk about how these studies relate to free will and moral responsibility, as well as Christian's own view.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Christian Miller, who's the A.C. Reed Professor of Philosophy at Wake Forest University. Christian works on several topics in ethics, including character, moral motivation, and virtue, recently focusing on the virtue of honesty in particular. He's the author of several books, including The Character Gap, How Good Are We?, published in 2017 by Oxford University Press. He's also a science contributor at Forbes, as well as the principal investigator for the Honesty Project, a multi-million-dollar project funded by the John Templeton Foundation. Christian's very good at bringing scientific research to bear on questions in ethics, especially from findings in psychology. And he's written specifically on the topic of this episode, situationism and free will. So we're excited to get to chat with him today. So welcome to the show, Christian. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Sure, thanks. So first, I want to say thank you for having me on the show. It's a real honor, and we look forward to our conversation. Well, who am I? I mean, I'm Christian Miller. You already said that. I've been working at Wake Forest University here for 17 years. After that, I got my graduate degree in philosophy at Notre Dame and my undergraduate degree in philosophy at Princeton. I started out working in a different set of issues, related to ethics. And that was the topic of the objectivity of morality. So is morality objective, or is it more a matter of our own creation, individual or cultural invention? And that was something I wrestled a lot with in my dissertation, and then for several years after I got my job at Wake Forest. As time went on, I kind of said what I wanted to say. I didn't have much else to say, so I was looking around for something else to talk about, and I moved in the direction of character. And that has been my main focus for the last 10 plus years. I'm really grabbed by a couple issues. One is, what is character, the definitional, more conceptual issue? What is virtue? What is vice? I'm also really intrigued by the question of how good is our character as a matter of fact. So that's a more empirical question where I draw on research in psychology. And then the third issue that's really been more central for me recently is how can we grow in character and improve our character, close the gap between the character we actually have and the character we should have, hence the name of the book, The Character Gap. So that's, broadly speaking, what I've been working on. As far as it connects to today, the topic of situationism has been really central to discussions of character for the last 20 or so years in the philosophy literature. And I got interested in that particular debate, which we'll say more about in a minute, what situationism means, and had my take on that debate about situationism, and then saw that there were some interesting implications for situationism with respect to moral responsibility and free will, and I wanted to investigate those a little bit, and I did so in a piece in the Rutledge Handbook on Moral Responsibility.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Very, very cool. So you've already used this term a few times, situationism. It's a term that's used in psychology and in philosophy, and it's not always clear that it means the same thing. So why don't you go ahead now and explain what you mean by situationism? What are the central ideas, and what are some of the differences that you've seen in psychology and philosophy?
Sure. So this is a big topic, and let me try to keep it brief. The situationist movement in psychology really ramped up in the 1960s and early 1970s, and then died out for the large part and was replaced by other views. The leading psychologist at the time who associated with situationism is a psychologist named Walter Mischel. He wrote a book called Personality and Assessment that appeared in 1968. And I think there are two main ideas that I associated with situationism in psychology. And then a third idea I'll also mention at the end. So the first one is that on empirical grounds, we have good reason for thinking that personality traits are rare. Personality traits of a traditional kind which are meant to be traits of our psychology that are consistent across situations and stable over time. Traits like extroversion, for example, or agreeableness or conscientiousness. That these traits, which we often talk about a lot in ordinary discourse and ascribe to other people and to ourselves, as a matter of fact, when you study them carefully and empirically, do not seem to have much empirical traction or support for their existence. So they're rarely possessed. That's a negative claim. More positive claim that was made in the situationist movement in psychology is that instead of personality traits existing and influencing, guiding our behavior is primarily, if not entirely, under the influence of situational features in our environment. So external factors which would lead us to act a certain way when we were in their presence. So this is now going from the inside, saying the inside is not so central to understanding behavior. That's the outside external factors. And I'll give you, when we talk about some of these studies that were very influential in the situationist movement, I can give you some examples of what some of those situational influences might be. So here, the second idea is that behavior is primarily, if not entirely, the result of situational influences as opposed to internal personality traits. The third idea, which was not so central at the time maybe, but I see as a really important lesson that we could learn subsequently from this movement, is that I think what the situationists, one thing that the lesson that we learned is that unconsciously we are often moved or influenced by psychological dispositions which we may not recognize. So I don't think the right lesson from the situationist movement in psychology is that our behavior is entirely a matter of external features of our environment. I think one main lesson that emerged later is that we are primarily influenced in our behavior a great deal more than we might have thought by unconscious factors.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you some examples of those too in a second. Now take all that and bracket it for the moment. That's on the psychology side. On the philosophy side, we see situationism really not discussed at all until a little bit in the 1990s with a philosopher named Owen Flanagan. But really, the watershed moment was at the turn of the century with two philosophers, John Doris and Gilbert Harman, who had read a lot of this material from the 60s in psychology and a lot of the relevant studies. And they thought that there were unexplored philosophical implications. Their focus was different, though, in a couple of respects. They're primarily interested in moral virtues and vices, as opposed to personality traits in general. So they're interested in things like compassion and honesty and generosity and gratitude. And secondly, a key difference is that they were interested in this debate about the existence or non-existence of these virtues in service of a larger philosophical project of criticizing a view in ethics. So they wanted to say that virtue ethics, one of the leading theories of ethics today in normative ethics, alongside utilitarianism and Kantian ethics, there's a view called virtue ethics. They said, look, if you take this empirical literature seriously and you draw the implications we want you to draw, you're going to realize that this view in ethics, virtue ethics, is at a disadvantage. It's got some serious problems on empirical grounds. And that's a whole other discussion, not so much for free will and more responsibility, but a whole can of worms was opened up, and lots of papers were written and books were written to see whether virtue ethics really was in trouble or not.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's really helpful. So you mentioned we'll talk about some studies. Maybe you could go ahead and talk through a few examples of studies either from the 60s or later that give support for one or more of these points associated with situationism.
Sure. So I think what I said was pretty abstract. I think the studies will actually help it make it more concrete.
Right.
So I'll give you four, but I won't dwell on them at length. Two famous ones from the 60s, and then two that came along later, but tie into situationist themes.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the most famous study of all in the history of psychology from the 1960s is one by Milgram. It involves the famous shock experiments, where a participant comes in, administers a test to someone else in the next room. Every wrong answer the person in the next room gets, the participant is supposed to turn up a dial more and more. The dial administers a shock to the person in the next room as punishment for getting a wrong answer. There's an authority figure present who is putting pressure on the participants to continue to administer the test and turn the dial up for more and more wrong answers.
Right.
And lo and behold, just condensing this very, very much down to the bare essentials, the majority of participants, 65%, were willing to turn the dial all the way up to the XXX lethal level of shock and seemingly kill an innocent test taker in the next room under pressure from an authority figure. This touches on some of the themes raised earlier. One, doesn't look like virtue is playing much of a role here, that in preventing this person from acting that way. Personality traits in general don't seem to be doing much explanatory work. Two, the pressures from the situation are doing a lot of work, it seems like. And three, touching on the issue of surprising dispositions or unconscious influences, it illustrates the extent to which we are willing to obey authority figures much more than we might have thought otherwise.
Yeah.
We're much more psychologically inclined in that direction. Okay. Next study, also from the 1960s, group effect study. So this is the famous lady in distress study. You're a participant, you come into a room, you're filling out a survey, another stranger comes into the room, is told to fill out the same survey, both of you are working together, the person in charge leaves the room, goes into the next room, a few minutes later you hear a big crash in that room, the person in charge starts screaming in pain, sounds like there's been a major accident, she needs help. What do? Well, participants, when the stranger they were with did nothing, largely did nothing themselves. Only 7% helped when the stranger they were with did nothing to help. 7%. When a participant in a different version of the study, a participant was alone without a stranger, just by him or herself, and the emergency happened next door, 70% helped.
That's crazy.
So 70 versus 7 based upon, well, what? Doesn't seem like personality, your personality traits, your character traits. So that's that theme again. A situational environment is having a big impact. The non-helping of the stranger seems to be primarily influencing the results. And what's the psychological explanation? Well, one key element here is fear of embarrassment. That you don't want to make a fool of yourself in front of this stranger if it turns out that there's really not an emergency going on in the next room. So another underappreciated psychological impact on our behavior, influence on our behavior. Third study and fourth study I can do very quickly. The third is helping was dramatically influenced in a study depending upon whether people were coming out of a bathroom or not. So people were coming out of a bathroom and asked to perform a helping task, helped about 80% of the time. When other participants were just walking down a hallway and approached you the same helping task, it was 45% of the time. The situation mattered. And it was here this story has to do with embarrassment relief. Not embarrassment avoidance, but embarrassment relief, having gone to the bathroom. Last one, smell study in a shopping mall. Controls were just walking by a clothing store. The other group that was more interesting was walking by Mrs. Fields cookies or Cinnabons, getting the smell. The controls helped about 10 to 15% of the time. The people who were walking by the Cinnabons helped about 60% of the time. Same helping task. Personality doesn't seem to have an impact. Situation seems to have an impact. And here the psychological story involves wanting to maintain a good mood, the desire to maintain a good mood, which is underappreciated as far as its impact on behavior.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll stop. That was a lot.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. So, does situation provide some kind of support for psychological determinism? What do you think about this?
Yeah. So I should caveat this all what we're going to talk about by saying, look, I'm not an expert in the stuff you guys are experts in. I'm not a free will scholar, more responsibility person. So take what I say with a grain of salt, and push back if you want to. At least as far as the literature has gone here, people who discuss the situationism movement and its implications for free will and responsibility, the consensus has been no, it does not support psychological determinism, and that's not where the interesting issues are.
Yeah.
For one thing, there are individual differences in how people behave in the same situations. So go back to one of the examples, Milgram, 65% all the way to the XXX level, not 100%.
Yeah.
Lady in distress, 70% helped when alone, but not 100%. So the individual differences in the same situation. And secondly, people have been interested in not whether there's determinism here or not. It's more, what's more interesting is the particular pattern of response that you're seeing and what people's behavior is sensitive to and what it's not sensitive to.
Yeah.
And what implication that might have for free will and responsibility. So I think that's right myself. And so I don't think that's where the main interest is.
So where would the main threat be if there is a threat to free will from situationism?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two places. One is reasons responsiveness, and the other is implications for agency. So let's do the reasons responsiveness. So many people have talked about how reasons responsiveness is somehow a requirement for either free will or moral responsibility. I talked about it more in connection to moral responsibility.
Yeah.
That is a necessary condition. That if you're not appropriately reasons responsive, then you're not appropriately morally responsible. What does that mean, and why would that connect to situationism? Well, because after all, in these studies, people do seem to be responsive to some kind of reasons or other. I mean, they're responsive to reasons of authority, responsive to reasons of embarrassment, or responsive to reasons of maintaining a good mood. But that's not the kind of reasons responsiveness that's at stake in the literature. It's right reasons responsiveness.
Yeah.
Right.
People don't seem to be responding to the right, morally right kind of reasons. You want, and I mean, I hope that's pretty clear. These are not from a virtue perspective, from a moral perspective, more generally, the appropriate reasons to be sensitive to in these situations. You should be sensitive to the suffering of the person, the cries of help. So then you could maybe leverage an argument then that something along the lines, moral responsibility requires rights, reasons, responsiveness. In the situationist research, we find lots of cases in which people are not rights, reasons, responsive. Therefore, they're not morally responsible for their actions. And yet it certainly seems like they're morally responsible, and we would want to hold them more responsible. So it looks like this is going to require us to maybe rethink our moral responsibility practices in these cases. I'll pause there. Hopefully that made sense. Now I think there are lots of things to say in response to that. One is just you could concede, okay, in these cases, people are not morally responsible, but there are plenty of other cases in which they are responsive to the morally right reasons, and so moral responsibility is preserved, at least in some cases. I don't think that's good enough. I want to say, look, even in these cases, we should be able to hold people morally responsible, and that they are, in fact, morally responsible. And so how could that work? Well, this gets into more technical, complicated issues about reasons responsiveness. So when you get into this literature, which you all got into much more than I have, there turns out to be different views out there. So there's strong reasons responsiveness. Well, where it has to be actually responsive to the correct moral reasons. Okay, that's not happening, but that's too high of a requirement. That's an implausible requirement. There's weak reasons responsiveness. So there just has to be some possible world in which there's a kind of responsiveness to the correct moral reasons, but that seems like too weak of a requirement. So then we have to find a kind of, Fisher, John Fisher, and others in this literature are looking for a kind of moderate view, an intermediate position. Okay, well, we have to hone in on the details of that and get that all worked out, and then test it against these cases and see whether you get that kind of reasons responsiveness or not. And I don't know if this is the right time or place to do that, but I can just report to you that from what I've seen, the proposals out there give me some hope that there still would be moral responsibility. There still would be, that condition would still be met, of a moderate reasons responsiveness still being met
Right.
in these cases.
Yeah.
Yeah. That seems right to me too. But there's still something troubling about the results of these studies. I guess in your chapter that you mentioned earlier in the Rutledge companion to free will on situationism and moral responsibility, you talk about like two connections between situationism and the free will moral responsibility literature. One is reasons responsiveness. I find that interesting, and I think you're right. Once you get the right view worked out, it's going to have the right results that we want in these cases. These people do count as morally responsible. But I think the other connection was about unconscious processing. So maybe we could turn to ask about that. Maybe part of the worry about these cases is something to do with these unconscious influences on our actions.
Yeah. And I have to confess, I find this more troubling as well. So here's the idea. We need to bring an agency at this point. So you have to buy a couple premises or assumptions here. And if you buy these assumptions, then you've got a problem. So if you think that free will / moral responsibility require you to exhibit agency, and if you think you don't exhibit agency when your behavior is influenced by, or primarily influenced by, unconscious motives and desires, then you've got a problem with when the situationist literature comes along. Because as we've already spent time going over, a lot of these studies, a lot of the discussion has to do with how surprising dispositions are at work unconsciously in our minds. Mm-hmm. They're surprising, not that they exist in the first place, but they're surprising the extent to which they're operative.
Yeah.
The extent to which, we know that we have a desire to obey authority figures, but we probably didn't realize it was this extensive that we would obey a scientist to the level of killing an innocent person. And then same thing with the other three studies I mentioned. Mm-hmm. So again, if you think that free will and / moral responsibility connected to agency, and you think agency requires conscious deliberation and reflection, and then you think, well, look at all these cases where it's a lot of unconscious stuff is leading people to behave a certain way, then free will / moral responsibility are going to be in some trouble, at least in those cases.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge. At least as I would portray it or develop it. I'm not an expert here. So if that's the challenge, where can you go? Well, I think you can go to a variety of different directions. You can do the same thing again of conceding, okay, these cases, failures, but there are plenty of other cases where there's conscious deliberation. Mm-hmm. I'm not so satisfied about that. You could say, look, you could go in the direction of saying, these are really outliers and exceptional cases, and and much more than people are appreciating. Conscious motivation is really operative today. There's a tendency in the literature, psychology literature, to emphasize the role of the unconscious, but some people are pushing back against that. And like Baumeister, for example, at Florida State, and saying, no, conscious deliberation or reasoning is much more operative than you might have thought. Okay, that's an interesting debate, but still doesn't take this challenge head on.
Yeah.
In these particular cases, if you want to say that people are free / more responsible, how are you going to be able to do it? Well, I think you're just going to have to question that other assumption that agency requires conscious deliberation, and carve out some room for unconscious activities still being an expression of our agency for which we can be held morally responsible. And I'm sure there are lots of ways to do that. One, I'll mention two at least, but here's one: is in terms of, okay, well, in the moment it's unconscious influence, so I'm not aware of it. But so long as counterfactually, if I were aware of it, I would endorse that influence. That's enough for it to be an expression of my agency. So to say that again, for those who are not, the language might be a little bit unusual, counterfactual. So for it to be an expression of my agency, either I have to consciously be aware of the influence, or if I'm not consciously aware of the influence, it is such that if I were to become aware of it, I would be fine with it. I would endorse it or accept it. That's one way to go. Another way to go is to say, look, so long as it is in accordance with my values and what I care about, that unconscious influence, even if I'm not aware of it, is still something for which I can be held responsible and as an expression of my agency. So this is a harmony view between what I value and care about the most and that influence. Harmony, yes. Agency, disharmony, no. Failure of agency.
Yeah.
So two suggestions along those lines.
Another suggestion, see if this works. John Martin Fisher, the reasons responsive view that you mentioned, he calls his view a historical view of moral responsibility. So the two views that you just mentioned it seems like they're characterized in ways that are non-historical. And what I mean by that is a modal view. All that matters is facts about you now, like these modal facts. The virtues, it's kind of like a mesh view, where if you're meshed you're psychologically in the right way, that just matters about, or the only thing that matters in that case is facts about you now. But Fisher says that how you came to be the way you are matters. And so I'm wondering if there's another way of working this out, where maybe people have made conscious decisions in the past that influenced how they are now. And so now they're morally responsible for pushing the button that kills the patient because of all these Robert King calls them will-setting moments in their history.
I like that as a general point, and I like that idea in particular with character traits and virtues. But I'm not sure it's going to do all the work that needs to be done here, because I'm not sure we could trace back to a will-setting moment for some of these unconscious influences. So take my desire to maintain a good mood. That seems to be operative in that smell study. Why? So people help more often when they're around Cinnabons or Mrs. Fields cookies. Why? Well, the smell is so pleasant, puts me in a good mood, which activates a desire to maintain a good mood. Well, here comes an opportunity to help someone else. I see it as an opportunity to maintain my good mood, so I'm more inclined to help. All along, I'm not probably aware of the influence of this desire to maintain a good mood. I think, what I'm consciously thinking about, so here's someone who needs help, and I have a few extra minutes, and I can help them out. But what's really influencing my behavior is this desire to maintain a good mood. Well, can we go back in time and find this kind of will-setting moment for the desire to maintain a good mood? I can't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, me neither. Right.
and then you start going down a path. Okay, desire to alleviate feelings of embarrassment. That was the bathroom one. Uh, a desire to avoid embarrassment. That's the group effect one. A desire to obey authority figures. That's the Milgram one. Now, maybe it comes in degrees, maybe it's more so than others. Maybe,
Mhm.
when you were a child and you wanted to obey your parents or something like that, and you like made some conscious decisions at that point. But I'm still not thinking, I'm thinking that on all four cases, it's going to be hard to do some tracing back to conscious earlier moments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
I know Taylor's going to agree with you because he's anti-historicist in some ways.
I'm not that anti-historical. I'm okay with tracing. I was actually going to ask the same question, Matt. I'm really
Okay.
glad you asked that.
All right. Great
You
minds think
framed it really
alike.
well. That's right. Well, Christian, so your view, you've pushed back in some of your work against some of the, especially the philosophers arguing about the implications of situationism, and your view is slightly different. You call it a mixed trait approach. So maybe before we wrap up, could you say a little bit about your view and how it's different from the situationist view?
yeah. So this will take a little bit of stage setting. So let's leave aside a lot of what we talked about and go back to the first key point that the empirical evidence suggests that personality traits and character traits are rare. In the psychology movement, that was a point about personality traits. In the philosophy movement, that's the point about moral virtues, that they're rarely possessed. So I think I'm in agreement there. I read the psychology literature and I draw the same conclusion, at least about the moral virtues, that there is abundance of evidence which runs against the expectations I would have if most people were virtuous.
Right.
If most people are virtuous, I expect them to behave a certain way. I don't see people behaving that way. So I'm in agreement with Harman and Doris on that point.
Okay.
I'm also in agreement with them that the vices are rare. I think that when you think about something like dishonesty, you can generate some predictions. If most people were dishonest, you predict them to do this, 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 and this. And then you look at the empirical literature and you don't see those predictions playing out. Where I go in my own unique direction is with the positive story I want to tell. Because these are just negative views. They're saying, look, most people are not like this. Most people are not virtuous. Most people are not vicious. Well, then what are people like? Tell me something more constructive. Harman and Doris, those are the philosophers, they have a positive story that they've worked out just a little bit, but they never really did much with it. They have what they call local traits. So it's not that people are compassionate in general across a lot of situations, or honest in general across a lot of situations. At best, people are going to be honest just in test-taking situations. So hence the name local to that particular situation.
Mm-hmm.
Or compassionate just at shopping malls. That's their picture. I could say, well, I don't like that picture if you want, but here's my alternative picture. I read the same literature they read, and I draw a different implication or a different conclusion. I say, look, there's evidence of cross-situational consistency in people's behavior. Global traits, not local traits. That people do have a kind of character that is going to be consistent across situations. It's just not a virtuous character, and it's not a vicious character. It's what I call a mixed character. And this kind of character is not going to be good enough to count as virtuous, not going to be bad enough to count as vicious. So it's in between the two ends of the spectrum. And it's constituted by a whole bunch of psychological dispositions, which will lead people to behave well in some circumstances and poorly in other circumstances. Well, we've kind of touched on this already, so we can draw on some of the earlier discussion. Take that desire to maintain a good mood. That disposition will be part of the mixed helping trait. So in a demand of helping, it's not going to be compassion. That's the virtue. It's not going to be callousness. That's the vice. It's going to be a mixed helping trait. And then one of the constituents, among many, is going to be a desire to maintain a good mood in order to desire to help others in order to maintain a good mood, to get the helping in there, which is positive in some respects because, after all, it leads people to help. But it's not virtuous. It's not an admirable kind of reason. It's not the morally right kind of reason, like we talked about earlier, for helping other people. So it doesn't get you all the way to virtue. It is cross-situational, though. It will lead people to help in a variety of different circumstances whenever they think they can maintain a good mood. So unlike local traits with Harmon and Doris, which says, no, it's just indexed to the mall or indexed to the party or indexed to the courtroom, I say our character actually does show consistent patterns across situations, like in this one. People will consistently help across situations if they see an opportunity to maintain their good mood. There's nothing special about shopping malls.
Right.
Yet, at the same time, that's not a virtuous character or a vicious character. And then you take that example and you run with it for other constitutive elements of the mixed helping trait. It's not just a desire to help in order to maintain a good mood. It's also going to be a desire to help in order to alleviate feelings of embarrassment, a desire to help in order to avoid feelings of embarrassment, a desire to help in order to avoid a bad mood, and so forth and so on. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly we've got a picture of robust character that's intermediate between virtue and vice. And the story goes from there. There's more to say, but
yeah,
hopefully that's situated enough.
Yeah, interesting. You've also written about practical implications of this too. So if somebody wants to, I don't know, remove some of the bad parts of their character and add some good parts or reinforce the good parts, what practical application advice do you give?
Yeah, I advise it to buy my book. No.
Of course.
Just kidding. Yeah, no, absolutely not. No. That just feeds into my bad character and my royalties. So you're right. So, I mean, we have to first have a couple assumptions here. One is that character is malleable. So if it turns out we have mixed character, but we can't do anything about it, then there's no point in talking about a character improvement because you're kind of stuck with what you got. But there's good empirical evidence to think the character is malleable, which hooks up to ordinary intuition too. Second assumption is that it's valuable to develop the virtues and not just remain at a mixed character. And I have a chapter in that book in which I try to make the case that virtue is valuable and worth cultivating, and we should spend some time on it. Okay, so then how do we do it? Well, I go through a variety of different strategies and kind of assess them both philosophically and also empirically. What's the data backing up that strategy? I'll give you, just by way of illustration, I'll give you, how about just two examples? One example is the importance of moral role models, moral exemplars, leaders who do much better than us. And so the idea is, look, you find someone, let's make it concrete. I look at my character, I see I am falling short in the area of honesty. How can I improve in honesty? Well, might be a moral role model who does much better than I do in this area, like Abraham Lincoln, to take a historical example, or might be my colleague at work, to make a real relatable, tangible example. Mm-hmm. And I can admire that person, first of all. And then secondly, in virtue of admiring that person, want to emulate that person. This is what the psychologist Haidt calls elevation. To elevate my character, I have a feeling of wanting to elevate my character to better reflect that person's character as opposed to dragging that person's character down to my character. So we can be motivated to bridge the character gap that way. There's a lot more to say about that, but that's just getting the idea out there. Mm-hmm. The second example that I'll toss out there too is the example of moral reminders, where often we do know what the right thing to do is, but we get our perspective askew and we get caught up in the moments of self-interest and how this might give me pleasure, and it's, given to temptation and things like that. So moral reminders can be very useful to get our priorities back on track. So to help with that a little bit more, most of us think that cheating is wrong, but there are times in which the temptation to cheat can be very strong and we give into it. If we think we can benefit and not get caught, things like a moral reminder could come along and get our perspective back to the wrongness of cheating. So in an educational context, since we care a lot about that, everyone on this interview, something like an honor code that a student has to sign before taking a test, there's good empirical evidence that can curb subsequent temptation to cheat on the test. There's both self-report data and experimental data finding that honor codes are effective in this regard. And what are they doing? They're serving as moral reminders. And then you generalize from that point to think about what other kind of areas of my life would benefit a lot from having moral reminders, and what might those moral reminders look like, whether it's text messages, things I hang on the wall, a reading I start my day with, a diary I end my day with. Those could all be different examples of moral reminders to get us, keep us actually going on the right path.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to talk more about this, but we're running out of time. As a philosopher who's worked in or interacted with science, where do you think that there's going to be interesting developments? What areas of science do you think are going to be most fruitful for philosophers who are interested in free will to explore?
Yeah. So that there I could say a lot of big picture stuff and point to a lot of stock examples like neuroscience and so forth. I think it'd be maybe more interesting to answer that specifically in connection to our conversation today. So when I give this answer, then I'm not saying this is the only place. There are plenty of other interesting areas, but just what is cool here, or what would be interesting to look at more. One really interesting thing about this whole character and situationism and moral responsibility discussion is that it's been very narrowly focused on studies having to do with helping and harming.
Mm-hmm.
All four examples I gave were of that variety: Milgram, lady in distress, shopping mall, and coming out of the bathroom were either helping or harming studies. It would be really beneficial for there to be either more research or a greater awareness of existing research that had to do with the vast array of other areas of morality besides helping and harming.
Yeah.
After all, what about things like honesty, which I've given as an example?
Mm-hmm.
What about things like generosity? What about things like gratitude? What about things like justice, temperance, and so forth? Are there similar trends there where you see surprising dispositions, unconscious influences, powers of the situation? Do the results generalize across the different moral domains, or is this more kind of localized to the research on helping and harming?
Yeah.
And so that's a very specific answer related to our conversation today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that does sound worth exploring.
And part of why we're doing the project we're doing now, which is the Honesty Project. So we're trying to get more attention paid to other areas of morality besides these two areas that have got a lot of attention.
Yeah, I'm thinking about parenting too. So I want my kids to be virtuous. So I need to bake fresh cookies more often.
Well, you might get better behavior. Not that you're going to get virtue though.
Right.
They need the role models and the moral reminders. Yeah.
If you're an Aristotelian like I am, motivation's got to be there too, as well as behavior.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you're also a parent like I am, you might be happy just to get better behavior.
I'll settle for the behavior now.
Yeah, exactly. Take what you can get.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Christian. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Sure. So I'm on social media at Character Gap, one word, Character Gap, on Twitter and Facebook. And I also have a website, christianbmiller.com, which has links to articles and interviews and so forth. So And I'm also, of course, just happy to email with anyone. millerc@wfu.edu. Just give my email address out. Anyone who wants to write directly and have a conversation about these issues or looking for further resources, just feel free to reach out to me directly.
Cool.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks again so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll make
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll post those in those websites in the show notes. Our next episode, we're turning to physics and free will, and our guest will be Janan Ismail, professor of philosophy at Columbia University.